Hi, everyone. I'm Caitlin Huey-Burns coming to you from our Washington, D.C. bureau. It's good to be with you. Thank you for joining us. Here's a look at some of the stories we're watching right now. Denials and rebuttals following testimony from Cassidy Hutchinson, a former aide to White House Chief of Staff Mark Meadows, about the January 6th insurrection. What more we're learning from Tuesday's January 6th hearing and where the investigation could go from here. A criminal investigation against a former attorney to President Trump is ramping up. The latest on the investigation into John Eastman and what it could mean for the January 6th inquiry. After Russia's military assault on Ukraine, the United States is poised to make its most significant military expansion in Europe since the Cold War, where President Biden is putting a permanent troop presence, and when we could see the NATO alliance expand. And later this hour, following the Supreme Court's reversal of Roe v. Wade, political parties are retooling for a series of contests ahead of the midterms. We'll speak with strategists from both sides of the political aisle about how significant an issue they're expecting this to be and how to engage voters on it. Plus, after the deaths of dozens of migrants in an overheated truck, a political battle is on the southern border. Why Governor Abbott started and stopped truck inspections, and how the Biden administration is dealing with a massive influx of attempted crossings. We begin with the continued firestorm of reaction to Tuesday's January 6th committee hearing and the testimony of Cassidy Hutchinson, a former aide to White House Chief of Staff Mark Meadows. She cataloged throughout her testimony the series of events in the days leading up to January 6th and during the riot on that fateful day. Some of the most startling revelations included then-President Trump wanting to lead the rioters to the Capitol and insisting that armed members of the crowd were, quote, not here to hurt me. For more on the committee's latest hearing, Nicholas Wu and Matt Brown join me now. Nicholas is congressional reporter for Politico, and Matt is national correspondent for The Washington Post. Good to see you both. Thanks for being here. Nick, I want to start with you because at the end of yesterday's hearing, Chairman Benny Thompson issued an open invite, essentially, to anyone who could shed some further light on any of the testimony offered so far. So what do we know about who might actually take him up on that offer?
Okay, well, no one has come forward publicly quite yet to say that they're willing to testify under oath and on the record about any of these allegations that were made in yesterday's hearing. But it's the committee's hope that all of this can help shake loose other witnesses, be it people from President Trump's security detail, like Robert Engel, who might be able to corroborate or rebut some of what Cassidy Hutchinson said. And also there's the committee's open call that's been out since last week for Pat Cipollone, the White House counsel, to come in again and talk to the committee about what he knew about everything that was going on in the White House on January 6th and leading up to it.
Yeah, it seems like after every hearing, we hear Cheney urging Cipollone to come and testify in front of the committee. Matt, I want to ask you about these Secret Service agents, because we know that the Secret Service has indicated that someone will potentially testify and rebut some of what Cassidy Hutchinson testified. But do we know about who may not likely want to come in front of the committee?
Yes, it's still basically a mystery on to who the Secret Service would be offering here. We're under the impression that Tony Ornato, the character in the Secret Service who Cassidy Hutchinson, much of her testimony centered around, would potentially be someone of interest for the committee. But whether or not he's actually going to testify is going to be a difficult question, especially given that he was a very close ally and advisor to Trump in a political capacity, not just in his capacity as a Secret Service agent, throughout the latter days of the administration.
Yeah, that's a really interesting dynamic. I'm curious to kind of follow those threads. Nicholas, another person that everybody really wants to hear from is Ginny Thomas. Of course, she's the wife of Supreme Court Justice Clarence Thomas, and she's been, having those conversations with Mark Meadows. We've seen the text messages, but you have some new reporting on the status of the committee's request to have some testimony from her. What can you tell us?
Well, not long after the hearing wrapped up yesterday, we obtained a letter from Ginny Thomas's lawyer, basically pouring a bit of cold water on the idea that she might come and testify before the committee. Now, let's remember last week the committee invited Ginny Thomas to come and speak with them after evidence emerged that she exchanged emails with John Eastman, who was the legal architect of Trump's bid to stay in power. And at the time, Thomas signaled that she might actually be willing to come in front of the committee. But in this letter, the lawyer spells out in 8 pages why it might not be possible for her to come before the committee. He basically said that the committee really needed to spell out why they needed to hear from her, why there was as he put it, a legislative purpose for them to hear from Ms. Thomas. And this hews somewhat closely to arguments that those engaged in current litigation against the Select Committee have voiced, that their testimony might not be necessary and might be outside the scope of the committee. And so the committee asked for Thomas to come in and testify behind closed doors at the beginning of July. And so as we get closer to that, we'll have to wait and see exactly how the Select panel handles what appears to be some stonewalling from Ginny Thomas.
Yeah, it'd be very interesting to hear from her if she does agree. Matt, after Hutchinson's testimony, do we have any clarity about how the Justice Department may react here, especially regarding former White House Chief of Staff Mark Meadows? I mean, we know that they decided not to pursue charges against him, but we also, after all of these hearings, we're all wondering what Merrick Garland and his Justice Department are going to do.
Exactly. And just on Friday, actually, a federal judge asked again for the Department of Justice to explain why they have declined to bring charges against Mark Meadows for not testifying for the committee. And then actually just yesterday, amid the Cassidy Hutchinson testimony, a very, very close Trump ally, Steve Bannon, even came forward and questioned why he's been prosecuted by the Department of Justice, but Mark Meadows hasn't. There's a lot of questions here around potentially, especially given Cassidy Hutchinson's testimony here, about what Meadows has not provided thus far because of the fact that he has not testified. It's going to be an interesting story to see maybe if he would be concerned about potentially perjuring himself in front of the committee and what potential deals he might have made with the Department of Justice as a result.
Yeah, we thought we knew a lot from those text messages, and then hearing Hutchinson's testimony was a whole other layer that asks so many more questions for Meadows. Nicholas, what about this case for a possible criminal conspiracy charge against former President Trump? I mean, after what we saw yesterday, do you have a sense about whether people think that case might be growing any stronger?
Well, we're certainly seeing the Select Committee lay out all of its evidence about President Trump's state of mind on January 6th, part of which could be key to proving any kind of case here. The committee's trying to make the case that Trump knew that there could be violence. He was informed that there were weapons and that he almost tried to okay people with weapons to come into his rally at the Ellipse on January 6th. And so the committee still has a few hearings left. They still have the report coming in September. And the expectation there is that at the end, they'll put all of their evidence out. And even if they don't explicitly say for the Justice Department to go and make a charging decision with the former president, they'll have put all of this evidence out there for prosecutors to use if they choose to do so.
Matt, I'm curious what you think as well. I mean, any sort of data points being connected here to bring up some kind of connection to criminal conspiracy?
Yes, definitely. So there's first the optics and the ethics of this, of a president behaving in the way that Cassidy Hutchinson described, as just an irate, is the word that she used, and generally unhinged character in the situation. That's not necessarily prosecutable by the Department of Justice. What is prosecutable, however, is conversations that Trump had and Trump's advisors had that showed that they were aware that extremist groups like the Oath Keepers, like the Proud Boys, were in attendance at the rally that they had organized and that were interested in going to the Capitol. What is prosecutable is the evidence that the committee debuted at the end of their hearing that showed that there might potentially be witness tampering here and interference with the January 6th committee's investigation into the attack itself. As many people say, it's not the crime, but it's the cover-up that's gonna get you, and that might be the situation here with Trump.
Sounds very familiar to Watergate 50 years ago, but that was certainly a way to end that hearing by Cheney saying that there might be some witness tampering involved here. We'll wait to see what the committee brings up next. Nicholas Wu and Matt Brown, thank you so much for your time and your reporting. Good to see you. The United States is putting more military assets in Russia's backyard after their invasion of Ukraine. President Biden made the announcement alongside NATO's Secretary General during the alliance's summit in Madrid. The expanded forces include the first permanent U.S. presence in Poland, fighter jet squadrons based in the UK, air defense systems in Germany and Italy, and 2 Navy destroyers stationed in Spain. CBS News Chief White House correspondent Nancy Cordes spoke with National Security Council spokesman John Kirby about the significance of those deployments.
And we want to make sure that we send a very clear message to Mr. Putin that, as President Biden has said, we're going to defend every inch of NATO territory. And right now, the area of concern is that eastern flank. So that's why these countries were chosen. And these are not insignificant muscle movements for the United States. I mean, this will keep our levels of forces on the European continent at about 100,000.
Sweden and Finland were also extended a formal invitation to join NATO on Wednesday. The 2 Scandinavian countries applied for membership after the war in Ukraine broke out. Turkey had threatened to veto their membership, but leaders reached an agreement ahead of the NATO summit. The attorney who drafted a legal plan to overturn the 2020 election wants his phone back from the feds. What John Eastman he's also dropped an attempt to block Congress's efforts to get information about who he was calling and when. More on where that investigation may go from here. Plus, over 1 million people in a dozen states have switched their party registration in the last year. Who stands to benefit and what we know about who those potential voters are. You're streaming Red and Blue.
I'm Norah O'Donnell in our nation's capital. We're here at the White House with the President of the United States.
Thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
You've never done an interview like this before.
That's correct.
Tonight, a congressional investigation sparked by reporting from CBS News. What's your message to consumers?
They need help now. Tell him I feel it.
The CBS Evening News with Norah O'Donnell from Washington, D.C. on CBS and streaming on Paramount Plus.
We will witness yet another moment in history. The threat of severe weather and dangerous tornadoes is expected to last.
Let's get the forecast from our partners at the Weather Channel.
Here we are in our virtual view.
Now 6 feet of water, imagine that. Cars that can act like battering rams.
These hyper-realistic simulations show you what the weather will look and feel like before it happens.
This is our virtual view, what it actually looks like.
Those are some of the best graphics I've seen.
Spare no expense, Gail.
We experience the weather in a whole new way.
Some of the most significant testimony from former White House aide Cassidy Hutchinson offered at Tuesday's hearing on the January 6th Select Committee had to do with security on Capitol grounds. Hutchinson told committee members that not only was the former president aware that attendees of his rally were armed, but he actually wanted metal detectors removed to make it easier for his supporters to get into the ellipse. Hutchinson also testified that she had heard Trump lunged for the wheel of the car transporting him and then at the neck of a Secret Service member, Bobby Engel. The Secret Service says it is fully cooperating with the investigative committee and will provide on-the-record responses to the new testimony. A source close to the agency tells CBS News that Engel and the driver are both prepared to deny that the former president lunged for either them or the steering wheel or any agent. Tuesday's surprise hearing comes 1 week after federal agents seized and searched a cell phone belonging to former Trump attorney John Eastman. You've heard his name a lot through all of this. In a suit filed just days after, Eastman said the seizure was illegal and agents forced him to unlock it. But then Eastman dropped the suit, trying to block access to his call logs. Agents also raided the house of former Justice Department official Jeffrey Clark last week. You heard his name a lot last week, too. A handful of former Justice Department officials testified last week of their threat to resign en masse if former President Trump were to install Clark as head of the agency. So joining me now with more on all of those investigations is
try and
CBS
break
News
it down.
Senior investigative correspondent Catherine
information.
Catherine, whoa, no shortage of news on this front, and I know you've been following every angle of these investigations. So let's kind of try to break it down for our audience. So, you have John Eastman. He dropped this lawsuit that he filed trying to block the January 6th committee from obtaining his phone records on Tuesday. What does that mean for the committee?
Caitlin, what it means is that congressional investigators, if they choose, can now get access to John Eastman's phone log metadata. And to break that down, we're talking about things like the phone numbers, who those calls were to, how long they lasted, and also the frequency of those contacts. And while it doesn't include the content of the phone calls themselves or email content, federal sources have said to me in the past that this metadata can sometimes be even more revealing than what was contained in those phone calls and those emails. And you're right to point out that this is a separate track, a separate legal track from his efforts to get back these phones that were seized by federal agents, physically seized by federal agents last week.
And Catherine, I remember when we were talking last week, you mentioned that the days leading up to January 6th were the days of interest. So what, if anything, would Eastman's phone records shed light on in the lead up to January 6th?
Well, Caitlin, federal investigators do something called link analysis. And what they do is they take these phone logs or the metadata and they plot it on a giant map. And it helps them understand your network of contacts and even more specifically, how strong those relationships are. When you take that link analysis or that network of contacts and you overlay other intelligence onto it that they have from witnesses, other call records, it starts to fill in the pieces of the puzzle. And more importantly, it starts to fill in the gaps in the timeline. And what we know through our reporting here at CBS News is that the congressional investigators are very focused on January 3rd, January 4th, January 5th, and then, of course, January 6th. So they're able to use that kind of information to bridge these gaps, to fully understand the events and who was talking to who at what point.
Yeah, I mean, along the lines of that timeline. I mean, Eastman's phone was seized the same day as that raid on Jeffrey Clark, who, of course, was the former assistant attorney general at the time. What do we know about that investigation? And can you kind of just remind us quickly who Clark was?
Clark was a very senior figure, a relatively senior figure in the Justice Department. His specialty was not criminal investigations. He was doing environmental law. And based on court records and the testimony before the committee, the allegation is that he was formulating this sort of plan B for President Trump, that they would come out and say the Justice Department had found significant concerns about election irregularities and that this would justify this alternate slate of electors that would then come to Capitol Hill and be sort of part of that confirmation or the certification process by the vice president on January 6th. What's so important about these raids and the seizure of the phones is that it happened basically on the same day in different parts of the country. They were both very public and very visible. And I have to emphasize that itself is highly unusual. That is called, in law enforcement speak, an extensive or unusual investigative tactic. What happens typically is that you ask the subject to provide the information, especially somebody who used to work at the Justice Department. So you'd have to have good reason to do this in a very public way and in a sort of spontaneous way when the person is unawares. There can be other reasons for that. Sometimes there's concern about the destruction of records or the erasure of some records. So that tells me from my experience, there had to be some element or evidence for probable cause to warrant that. The final point I want to make, because you really need almost like a board map to understand all the different investigations here. But what's important about Jeffrey Clark and also John Eastman is that based on the court filings, it appears this investigation is being run by the Justice Department's internal watchdog, the Inspector General. And one of the things that John Eastman's lawyer has argued is that they don't have jurisdiction over him. He didn't work for them. He worked as a sort of an assistant to then President Trump. But of course, we know who did work for the Justice Department, and that would have been Jeffrey Clark, right? So we've got multiple tracks of investigations here. You have the congressional investigation, you have this Justice Department criminal investigation, and now we know there's some sort of internal watchdog investigation looking at a lot of the same parties.
Yeah, Catherine, I kind of feel like this is an episode of Homeland where you kind of need that map on the wall with all those connecting dots. So that makes a lot more sense.
We'll get it for the next segment.
Yeah, exactly. That's the assignment. You know, and it's just fascinating how people like Jeffrey Clark and John Eastman are now becoming household names. Another interesting dynamic, kind of as we've been covering these hearings, is that a lot of people in Trump's inner circle have defied subpoenas to come testify. And you had former White House advisor Steve Bannon, another member of the inner circle. He actually filed a motion to delay his contempt of Congress trial until after October 15th, I believe. What could that kind of delay mean for him, and how might it relate to this investigation into January 6th?
Well, Steve Bannon is asking the judge, the federal judge in this case, to delay the trial, arguing that when it was scheduled, they had no idea that there would be this, what they described as a media blitz by the January 6th committee in these very public hearings. So they're making the argument that he certainly can't get a fair trial, or it may be extremely difficult to find a jury here in Washington, D.C. that hasn't formed an opinion about the case. If that is granted by the judge, that would be the second time that one of these high-profile January 6th related cases, has been pushed back. The other one was the Proud Boys, and they had their trial delayed until the end of the year. They succeeded in this argument that there was too much publicity surrounding this summer period, and that they may not get a fair trial or a fair jury. And the judge in that case, to quote, reluctantly agreed to that request. So we got to wait on Bannon, but one case has already been successful in sort of punting the ball down the field.
And Catherine, I also want to ask you about this news that Senate Sergeant-at-Arms Michael Stanger, he died on Monday. We still don't have a lot of information about what his cause of death was, but can you kind of explain what role he played in the Capitol insurrection and in the House committee's investigation?
Well, he's really kind of a clutch player in a lot of this. He was the top law enforcement officer leading up to and on the day when the Capitol was breached, and he's given gave a deposition some months ago where he talked about the importance of evaluating the security posture. He talked about some of the people that day as being sort of professional agitators. So he was going to the idea that, in his view, there was premeditation and coordination. And he said in his deposition, we have to now come back to a period where we see not just the probability of violence, but the real possibility of violence. And we have to take that posture. The one thing we have not heard so far in the January 6th public hearings is a real dissection of the decision-making that led to the National Guard only being deployed around the Capitol and around Washington, D.C. In a very limited capacity for crowd control and also for traffic control. And the reason that matters is what we know now, 18 months later, is that the system truly was blinking red. And the question is, if the system was blinking red and there was so much anticipation of violence, why more aggressive steps were not taken to safeguard the Capitol?
Yeah, a lot of questions about accountability on a lot of different levels.
Correct.
Catherine Herridge, we are very lucky that you are on this beat and investigating
always glad
this
to join you.
For us and for sharing your reporting with us.
I have my homework assignment next
we
time,
will be talking a lot, I'm sure.
The board.
We'll see
Something will come next.
Yes. Get your board ready. Catherine Herridge, as always, thank you so much.
You're welcome.
The overturning of Roe v. Wade is still fresh in the minds of many across the nation. But how prominently will the issue factor into the upcoming midterms? We've got two big political thinkers on how they think potential candidates should use this issue to get voters out to the polls. Plus, Texas Governor Greg Abbott says the death of dozens of migrants in San Antonio, Texas is President Biden's fault. The basis of his accusation and why Abbott himself stopped the truck inspections he implemented a few months ago. You're streaming CBS News.
An original documentary from CBS reports.
It's gonna be big!
The metaverse, the virtual world that's become a cryptocurrency casino.
It's like buying property on Mars.
Do they get an actual picture of this? No, it's a digital copy. Why would they pay for that?
Making millionaires almost overnight.
We made more than $1 million in crypto last year.
I have no idea how much money I have made over the past year. That's like, wow!
Big rewards.
There's gold in them, there hills, as they say.
Bigger risks.
The market's down, but it's going to bounce back. It's crypto.
Is it a gold rush or fool's gold?
It's our metaverse, our story. Peace out, y'all.
An original documentary from CBS Reports. Stream now.
We have an inspiring story that started with a strange act of kindness.
Yeah. We found it.
You're kidding me!
We got it.
We share stories that lift you up and brighten your day.
The Uplift. Stream on the free CBS News app.
I'm Norah O'Donnell in our nation's capital. We're here at the White House with the President of the United States.
Thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
You've never done an interview like this before.
That's correct.
Tonight, a congressional investigation sparked by reporting from CBS News. What's your message to consumers?
They need help now. Tell him I feel it.
The CBS Evening News with Norah O'Donnell from Washington, D.C. on CBS and streaming on Paramount Plus.
We will witness yet another moment in history. The threat of severe weather and dangerous tornadoes is expected to last.
Let's get the forecast from our partners at the Weather Channel. Here we are in our virtual view.
Now 6 feet of water, imagine that. Cars that can act like battering rams.
These hyper-realistic simulations show you what the weather will look and feel like before it happens.
This is our virtual view, what it actually looks like.
Those are some of the best graphics I've seen.
Spare no expense, Gail.
We experience the weather in a whole new way.
Welcome back to Red and Blue. Here's a look at some of the top stories we're following. President Biden says the U.S. will significantly increase its military presence in Europe in response to the war in Ukraine. The announcement was made at the NATO summit in Madrid, where the alliance formally invited Sweden to join. NATO leaders also declared Russia the most significant and direct threat to the allies' security. Supreme Court Justice Stephen Breyer's retirement becomes official on Thursday at noon, ending his nearly 28-year tenure on the bench. Before he leaves, the liberal justice has to help decide several cases before the court, including ones dealing with the environment and immigration. Ketanji Brown Jackson will take Breyer's spot on the day following his retirement. Protests continue across the country nearly 1 week after the Supreme Court overturned Roe v. Wade. We're also seeing lawsuits ramp up in states that outlawed or severely restricted abortion access following the court's decision. As Skylar Henry tells us, abortion rights could also factor heavily into the upcoming midterm elections.
Protesters on Capitol Hill called on lawmakers to take action to protect abortion rights.
Roe is dead. But we don't give up. The Supreme Court does not have the final word.
It simply gave the issue back to the elected representatives to be dealt with in the political process.
Tuesday, 8 states held primary or runoff elections, the first one since the Supreme Court's historic decision to overturn Roe v. Wade.
I will listen to people.
In Colorado, Joe O'Dea, a Republican who has voiced support for some abortion rights, beat an anti-abortion rights opponent in his U.S. Senate primary. Meanwhile, lawsuits continued to mount. Wisconsin's Democratic leaders filed a challenge against their state statute banning abortion dating back to 1849. Already, some state judges have temporarily blocked similar so-called trigger laws in Texas, Utah, and Louisiana, where providers at one of the state's 3 abortion clinics brace for next steps.
We're taking each day as we can, seeing as many patients as we can while we can.
The next battle over reproductive rights may have already begun after Supreme Court Justice Clarence Thomas suggested the court should reconsider any cases protecting access to contraceptives.
Clarence Thomas was quite forthright that he is inviting people to bring these challenges.
Following a surge in demand, several major pharmacies like CVS and Rite Aid are imposing limits on the purchase of emergency contraception, also known as the morning after pill. Skylar Henry, CBS News, the Supreme Court.
Results are in from the first primary since the overturning of Roe v. Wade. A Trump-supported Republican won in the primary for Illinois governor, while in Colorado's Senate primary, a Republican who supports abortion rights won out. For more on the midterms, Ray Zaccaro and Lauren Zelt join me now. Ray is Democratic strategist and principal at the Klein Johnson Group, and Lauren is Republican strategist as well as the founder and CEO of Zelt Communications. Great to have you both with us. I appreciate your time. Ray, I want to start with you because there was really some fascinating data released by the Associated Press that reports that over 1 million voters switched to the Republican Party last year across 43 states. So what's your take on why Democrats are losing prospective voters?
Well, Caitlin, thanks so much for having me on again. And I will tell you, look, anybody who's worked on any elections, and I've had worked on my share, will tell you that voter registration is not the best determining factor, of voter turnout or how voters are going to ultimately vote. What I will say is this. Democrats consistently worry every election cycle about what's going to happen with suburban women and how they're going to vote and turn out. Well, if ever there was an issue to motivate suburban women and their daughters and their mothers and their sisters and their families to turn out, it is the reproductive health crisis that is on the line in this election like it has never been before.
Yeah, that's such a fascinating dynamic, and I definitely want to ask you both a little bit about that in a minute. Lauren, I do want to ask a little bit about this AP data, because kind of going back to it, it shows that these suburban voters that you're talking about, they're behind the bulk of this shift that we've seen among Republicans. What do you think has led to this? Because in 2018, we saw suburban Republican women especially turn over to the Democrats. Now we're starting to see maybe some questions about whether they're turning over to Republicans this time around. What's behind that?
It's very simple what's behind that, and that is the state of our economy today. Unfortunately, we are seeing skyrocketing inflation that is affecting every single aspect of American life. And mothers and women are often the heads of the household in terms of making sure the bills are paid, doing the grocery shopping, making sure that the car insurance is up to date and all of that. And unfortunately, those prices are much higher than we saw not even a year ago, but especially since the beginning of the Biden administration. And so the switch to Republican, especially in the suburbs, is a direct result of the economic issues that we're facing right now, the fears of a coming recession, and questions that families have about how they're going to get through the next week, the next month, and the next year.
Yeah, those women being heads of household, and also we've seen women have to leave the workforce after the pandemic. Ray, I want to go back to what you were just mentioning, and whether these suburban women voters in particular might be motivated by the abortion rights issue. I found it was really interesting that Vice President Kamala Harris, in an interview with NPR, she said that the midterms are going to be vital, getting a law through Congress to codify abortion rights with Roe overturned. Biden says Roe is on the ballot. But, you know, Democrats had a supermajority once upon a time, and they didn't shore up abortion rights then. How can voters, Democratic voters, kind of believe what Democrats are saying when they're saying, hey, you need to show up and vote in elections, and they really haven't had much to show for it on that front? What's different now?
Well, I would argue that that's not the case when Democrats had a supermajority. We passed the Affordable Care Act. We made health care available to all Americans, improved access, and lowered costs. The fact of the matter is we are in a very different world today than we were just 2 weeks ago. We are in a world today where women woke up one morning and lost the right to govern their own body and health care. There are trigger laws, which you just talked about in a previous segment, throughout the country that are terrifying for women. Laws that were written in 1849 in Wisconsin, that was before doctors even knew how to wash their hands before surgery, and certainly long before women had the right to vote. I think this election has turned on a dime. It's going to be a very different cycle than what we have seen in the past. And in terms of Democrats holding up to their promises about governing and managing the issues that are important to voters, I'll tell you one thing, return a Democratic majority again after this cycle, and you will see action taken to secure the rights of women to have reproductive health choices available to them.
I mean, this is such a fascinating issue, and I just got back from Mississippi where it's reporting on the abortion issue, and it also goes to show how important local government and local races are in making these decisions. So it'll be interesting to see kind of whether there's a bigger focus on that. But Lauren, I want to ask you about how Republicans are going to be responding, because, I mean, this is something that Republicans have been very organized around for decades. They've been able to turn out their voters on this issue. They've really made the Supreme Court and abortion kind of a rallying cry for years. But now that it's actually overturned, do you think this is going to be something that Republicans are out there campaigning on offensively, or do you think they might be on defense and a little bit concerned perhaps about what Ray was just saying, that this may be a Democratic base motivator?
I think that the answer depends on the district or the state in which a candidate is running. If you're a candidate in a ruby red district or state, I do think that some Republicans are going to campaign on this as a potential victory. Now, That is very different in purple and blue leaning states. And honestly, I do think it's going to be very difficult for Republicans on the campaign trail this fall, because Ray's right. This issue is very important, and women woke up basically having 50 years of progress taken away in a lot of their minds. And so Republicans are no longer going to be able to get away with a position like, I'm personally against abortion, but it's the settled law of the land. That is no longer the case. And Republicans in purple states are going to have to grapple with this issue. And I do think that they could do well to show some empathy to the millions of women who right now are afraid, who are fearful about basic procedures that they may no longer have access to. And they're going to be looking to their elected officials to see what their positions on this issue are, because it is a different time. And I am afraid for some women in the states where access is very restricted, because there are some medical reasons that this might be necessary. And further, I think that the Democrats are in danger a little bit of this backfiring if they go too far. They used to have the message of it was tragic, but sometimes rare. And what we're seeing on the very far left is almost a celebration of the procedure and of the choice. And I think that can backfire with a lot of the suburban moms that the Democrats need to court back to do well this fall. And so I think it's complicated for people on both sides of the aisle, but I don't disagree. It's especially difficult for women, and for women voters in purple states, and candidates are going to have to respond in a way that shows empathy and shows that they're listening. That's really important.
Yeah, really interesting, and especially in those states like Michigan. I'm interested to see how that pans out. Ray, last week, this may have been missed with the decision of Roe, but the president actually signed into law something that was hailed as the most significant piece of gun legislation in 30 years. I mean, that's what we were all covering just last week. It was largely overshadowed by this decision, but is this kind of thing enough to help motivate Democratic base voters, or do you think by the time November comes around, they may have forgotten that this bill was signed?
It's pretty remarkable how news can change on a dime. Look, President Biden campaigned on something that is really significant and not lost on voters, which was he said he would work to bring Republicans and Democrats together to find reasonable solutions to the problems facing our country. And that's exactly what happened when Senator Murphy and Senator Cornyn got together with their colleagues across the aisle on both sides and passed this historic gun legislation for the first time in decades. Look, I will tell you just personally, I worked for a member of Congress whose husband was murdered in a mass shooting and her son was wounded. And she dedicated herself to trying to pass common sense gun legislation for years. And it finally happened now. This is significant. It's a motivator because it shows what happens when Washington works right.
All right. Well, this show is called Red and Blue, and I think we demonstrated in this segment that red and blue can actually talk to each other and find some common ground on some items, as you both did. So, Ray Zaccaro and Lauren Zelt, thank you so much for your time. I know we're going to be talking to you a lot as this midterm season picks up.
Thank you.
Thank you.
The Supreme Court has more cases left to decide this term on everything from immigration to climate change. In West Virginia versus the Environmental Protection Agency, the court will decide how much the EPA can regulate greenhouse gases from power plants. The court is also set to decide on whether or not President Biden can end the Remain in Mexico policy. That program, started under the Trump administration, sends some asylum seekers to wait in Mexico while their cases are decided. CBS News immigration reporter Camilo Montoya Galvez joins me now for more. Camilo, always good to see you. So how might this ruling against the Biden administration and the Remain in Mexico case policy change the U.S.'s approach when it comes to immigration?
Hi, Caitlin. At the center of this case is the Biden administration's decision last year to end the Trump-era Remain in Mexico policy, which requires migrants to wait for their court hearings outside of the U.S. Republican officials and Trump-era administration officials have said that this policy is an effective border control measure that discourages economic migrants from using the U.S. asylum system to stay and work here. But Democratic lawmakers and the Biden administration have argued, Caitlin, that this program places migrants at risk of being victimized in areas of Mexico where the State Department warns Americans not to visit because of high levels of crime and violence. The Supreme Court tomorrow is expected to decide whether the Biden administration can finally end the Remain in Mexico policy, which was reinstated in December because of a lawsuit filed by Republican officials in Texas and Missouri. But this case is bigger than just this policy, Caitlin. That ruling tomorrow could determine whether lower court judges have the legal authority to block and stop immigration changes by the executive branch. And that would be a huge ruling because, as you know, litigation has really shaped U.S. immigration policy on a national basis for the past 10 years.
Yeah, Camilo, far-ranging implications for that decision that we'll all be watching tomorrow. Another thing that you've been reporting on is this tragic, these dozens of migrants dying in triple-digit heat in a tractor trailer on Monday in San Antonio. I want to play a little bit of your conversation with Homeland Security Investigations Special Agent and then get your response on the other side.
This is an eye-opening, horrific event that we haven't seen these numbers before. This is the highest casualty event related to human smuggling in the U.S. history.
I mean, this is just a devastating story. What more can you tell us about the investigation into these deaths?
Yeah, Caitlin, the death toll in this tragic incident has unfortunately increased to 53 individuals. Another 11 individuals who were found at the scene of this incident remain hospitalized. The Department of Homeland Security has detained 3 individuals as part of its federal investigation into this suspected migrant smuggling operation. While the special agent in charge from the Department of Homeland Security did not get into the specifics of the investigation, which is still ongoing, he did tell me, Caitlin, that officials have recorded an increase in migrants paying thousands of dollars to smugglers so they can transport them in crowded tractor trailers, often with no air conditioning. And while this tragic incident is unprecedented in terms of the number of victims, it unfortunately is part of a broader trend, Caitlin. In 2021, officials said that approximately 650 migrants died attempting to cross the U.S.-Mexico border.
Yeah, indeed, unfortunate that this has happened before. I want to ask about Texas Governor Greg Abbott's response because he has touted border security agreements with Mexican governors. But Customs and Border Patrol encounters have gone up in 3 months since those deals were brokered. Is this, along with migrant deaths raising any questions about how effective Abbott's efforts have actually been at the border?
Yeah, Governor Abbott has certainly positioned himself as a leading opponent of President Biden's immigration and border policies. The Texas governor has already instructed officials to arrest migrants on state trespassing charges. He has deployed National Guard units to the U.S.-Mexico border. He has stopped licensing federal shelters for unaccompanied children. And he has also instructed state officials to intercept and stop vehicles suspected of transporting migrants who are released from Border Patrol custody. Many of these policies have been either limited or have been discontinued, Caitlin, including because of litigation, but they've been really limited and restricted by one important legal fact, Caitlin, and that is that state officials lack the legal authority to enforce federal immigration laws. And while, yes, the Biden administration and Governor Abbott have engaged in this political battle over U.S. immigration policy, in the meantime, border arrivals have continued to increase. In May, Border Patrol recorded an all-time high in apprehensions of migrants crossing the U.S.-Mexico border illegally.
A lot of finger-pointing going on politically, but Camilo, your reporting always highlights the humans behind these policies and who is actually impacted. So we thank you so much for your reporting and staying on this for us, and we're lucky to have you. Thank you.
Thank you, Caitlin.
Coming up after a break, I'll speak with Colorado Secretary of State Jenna Griswold about the growing politicization of her position and what she thinks could be done to safeguard election integrity as we get closer to the midterms. You're streaming Red and Blue.
original documentary from CBS reports.
Incredibly big!
The metaverse, the virtual world that's become a cryptocurrency casino.
It's like buying property on Mars.
Do they get an actual picture of this? No, it's a digital copy. Why would they pay for that?
Making millionaires almost overnight.
We made more than $1 million in crypto last year.
I have no idea how much money I have made over the past year. That's like, wow.
Big rewards.
There's gold in them there hills, as they say.
Bigger risks.
The market's down, but it's going to bounce back. It's crypto.
Is it a gold rush or fool's gold?
It's our metaverse, our story. Peace out, y'all.
An original documentary from CBS Reports. Stream now.
I'm Norah O'Donnell in our nation's capital. We're here at the White House with the President of the United States.
Thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
You've never done an interview like this before. That's correct. Tonight, a congressional investigation sparked by reporting from CBS News. What's your message to consumers?
They need help now. Tell him I feel it.
The CBS Evening News with Norah O'Donnell from Washington, D.C. on CBS and streaming on Paramount Plus.
We will witness yet another moment in history.
This week on 60 Minutes.
That's incredible.
The 60 Minutes.
60 minutes, 60 minutes.
Are you ready for some tough questions?
Let me ask you this.
You know how this sounds.
What's your response to that?
60 Minutes Sundays on CBS.
The threat of severe weather and dangerous tornadoes is expected to last.
Let's get the forecast from our partners at the Weather Channel. Here we are in our virtual view.
Now 6 feet of water, imagine that. Cars that can act like battering rams.
These hyper-realistic simulations show you what the weather will look and feel like before it happens.
This is our virtual view, what it actually looks like.
Those are some of the best graphics I've seen.
Spare no expense, Gail.
We experience the weather in a whole new way.
Go to the ends of the earth.
Right now.
We got something crazy. And reach for the stars.
Here we are.
Time.
Yes, it's my comeback.
Hey, this is pretty fun. But wait, there's more.
Experience thought-provoking,
Welcome to the idea of being a human being.
innovative, and truly original reporting.
Look through a telescope and go, wow.
Because there's always something new under the sun on CBS Sunday morning.
People from every corner of America facing challenges.
Everyone is just looking for some type of connection.
Just raise your hand and say, hey, I'd like to help.
Coming together to find solutions.
We are going to do something about it.
Their stories are our stories.
Welcome to Eye on America.
Stream now on the free CBS News app.
We have an inspiring story that started with a strange act of kindness.
Yeah. We found it.
You're kidding me!
We share stories that lift you up and brighten your day.
The Uplift. Stream on the free CBS News app.
Primary elections, runoffs, and special elections took place in a total of 8 states on Tuesday, with a number of surprising results. In Illinois, Trump-endorsed State Senator Darren Bailey won the Republican gubernatorial primary by over 40 points. He actually received a large amount of support from the Democratic Governors Association, as well as Democratic incumbent Governor J.B. Pritzker, who seemingly believes Bailey's far-right politics could make him easy to beat in the general election. In New York, Governor Kathy Hochul won the Democratic primary for her post. She'll face Republican challenger and GOP primary winner Congressman Lee Zeldin in November. In Colorado, moderate Republican businessman Joe O'Dea won the Republican Senate primary. He'll face off against incumbent Democratic Senator Michael Bennet in the general election. And in Illinois' 15th district GOP primary, which pit a pair of incumbents against each other due to redistricting, Mary Miller beat out Rodney Davis. Miller, at a recent campaign rally, said the Supreme Court overturning Roe v. Wade was, quote, a historic victory for white life. Her campaign says she misread the prepared remarks. Also in Colorado, incumbent Secretary of State Jenna Griswold, who went unopposed in her Democratic primary, will face off against Republican Pam Anderson in November's general election. Anderson, who believes the 2020 election was conducted securely and fairly, won her primary over 2 challengers, including Tina Peters, who was indicted in March by a grand jury on multiple charges related to a breach in her county's election system in the last presidential election. For more, I'm joined by Colorado Secretary of State Jena Griswold. Secretary, good to see you. Thanks so much for being here. Not many people would have really thought about what someone in your position typically does until recently. I mean, now you have your counterpart in Georgia at the center of a potential criminal lawsuit involving former President Trump. That's Secretary Brad Raffensperger in Georgia. He found himself in an increasingly common predicament, which is how do you convince constituents that your office has overseen free, fair, and transparent elections?
Well, first off, thank you for having me on. And that's a big question of our time. We're seeing the big lie used to fuel the insurrection. It's now used to push voter suppression, destabilize American elections, and erode confidence so that the next January 6th is easier. And secretaries of state and election workers need to remain committed to the truth, to pushing back on the lies. And it's important to continually message out, like in a state like Colorado, that there's bipartisan oversight over every aspect of the actual election. And one of the things I'm really proud of is we just launched a digital initiative with my predecessor, who I ran against in 2018. So it's a bipartisan message assuring Colorado voters that our elections are safe and secure. And with that said, we saw over 98% of voters during our primary continue to use their mail ballots.
That's a really interesting dynamic and important to have that kind of bipartisan buy-in, really. I mean, as you mentioned, the January 6th hearings, they have given Americans a real chance to hear about this pressure campaign from high-level Trump associates on a number of state officials. From your vantage point, what kind of backstops are in place to safeguard this process, or does it really just depend on the person in that position?
Well, it's both. And we are seeing from the January 6th hearings that a lot depends on good actors, people who will uphold their duty to the Constitution and the law. And one of the things I'm very concerned about is really the radicalization of the far right and the embracement of these conspiracies. We're seeing people who are charged with administering elections become security risks themselves because they're trying to prove conspiracies. So that's why you have to double down on the effort to strengthen laws. For example, Tina Peters, who was in the Republican primary and lost last night, she's charged for compromising her own voting equipment. She's a local county clerk who decided to become a security risk. So we acted very quickly. ID certified voting equipment. She is under indictment right now. But on top of that, I ran the first legislation in the nation, making it a felony to allow unauthorized access to voting equipment and to really get at those insider threats. So local government, state government, the federal government needs to do everything possible right now to safeguard democracy, but prosecutors also need to act. There needs to be disincentives. And what voters can do is make sure that these big lie candidates do not get elected to oversee our nation's elections in 2022.
Yeah, I want to ask you a little more about Peters and kind of the dynamics going on in Colorado, because as you mentioned, Peters faces criminal charges for tampering with voting equipment. I mean, of course, she was roundly rejected last night by voters in Colorado. So now you're set to square off against Pam Anderson. But she says that she's looking to look into alleged election fraud. Do you know what potential fraud she's referring to?
Well, Tina Peters' loss, I think, last night, and a lot of the election deniers' loss in Colorado is really a victory for the Colorado election model. We have vote by mail for all, weeks of early voting, and same-day voter registration, and Coloradans affirm their belief in our system and the use of that system. With that said, to your point, Pam Anderson did pander to the extreme right in her primary. She has also flip-flopped on things like automatic voter registration, which I led into law and set up, and that registered 250,000 people in the middle of the pandemic. She also failed to support our landmark voting rights legislation in 2019 that increased drop boxes in our security. So overall, I think, we are seeing from Republican candidates a rejection of modernism, of moderation that we really need in Secretary of State. As Secretary of State, I'm proud to always protect every Republican, Democrat, and independent voter, and that's what I will continue to do. I'm also proud of my record of increasing access to the right to vote and making sure Colorado maintains our gold standard in election security.
Well, I do want to ask a little bit more about that because we've seen a lot of Republican-led states passing restrictions after the 2020 election. They're kind of putting it under this banner of election integrity. But are there any election law changes that you would like to see? Is there anything that you should be doing differently?
Well, we can always innovate. That's why I led the largest democracy reform in the nation in 2019, increased drop boxes by 65%, partnered with the tribes. We saw an approximate increase in tribal voting in 3 years of 20%. That's also why I just led the nation's first piece of legislation on insider threats, passed legislation to protect election workers. It is now a crime to dox or retaliate against election workers, and led legislation to prohibit open carry within 100 feet of voting. So yes, we can always innovate, but lies and disinformation, pushing out lies about alleged mass fraud to try to win a primary, further spreads the big lie. And again, the big lie is dangerous. It's leading to threats against election workers. It's destabilizing American elections. And it's being used to lay the groundwork for the next January 6th. So democracy in so many states this election is literally on the ballot. We are seeing big lie candidates run to be the chief election officers in states across this nation. And voters will have a big task. And I am so optimistic because I know American voters are going to save democracy come November 2022.
Colorado Secretary of State Jena Griswold, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.
We're going to take a quick break, which means you have a couple of minutes to download the free CBS News app on all your devices. You can catch live local coverage from across the country from all of our CBS stations. And while you're at it, check out Paramount Plus. We've got a mountain of content there for you to stream as well, including your favorite shows, movies, and sports.
Go to the ends of the earth.
Right now.
We got something crazy.
And reach for the stars.
Here we are.
Time.
Yes, it's my comeback.
Hey, this is pretty fun.
But wait, there's more.
Experience thought-provoking,
Welcome to the idea of being a human being.
innovative, and truly original reporting.
Look through a telescope and go, wow.
Because there's always something new under the sun on CBS Sunday morning.
An original documentary from CBS reports.
It's gonna be big!
The metaverse, the virtual world that's become a cryptocurrency casino.
It's like buying property on Mars.
Do they get an actual picture of this? No, it's a digital copy. Why would they pay for that?
Making millionaires almost overnight.
We made more than $1 million in crypto last year.
I have no idea how much money I have made over the past year. That's like, wow.
Big rewards.
There's gold in them, their hills, as they say.
Bigger risks.
The market's down, but it's gonna bounce back. It's crypto.
Is it a gold rush or fool's gold?
It's our metaverse, our story. Peace out, y'all.
An original documentary from CBS Reports. Stream now.
This week on 60 Minutes.
That's incredible.
The 60 Minutes.
60 minutes, 60 minutes.
Are you ready for some tough questions?
Let me ask you this.
You know how this sounds.
What's your response to that? 60 Minutes Sundays on CBS.
U.S. health officials say 56,000 doses of the monkeypox vaccine are being shipped to communities most at risk. Clinics will initially prioritize anyone who may have been exposed to the virus. Experts say the vaccine can prevent disease and further transmission even if someone catches monkeypox. The vaccine can reduce symptoms. The virus spreads through close contact and causes a rash that can resemble chickenpox. While most will recover within weeks, it can be deadly. So far, the U.S. has reported more than 300 cases of the virus across the country. And that does it for today. You can stream Red and Blue Monday through Thursday at 6 p.m. Eastern. And a reminder, if you want to watch previous episodes of the program, you can see them anytime on the CBS News website. Just head to cbsnews.com/redandblue.
I'm Nora O'Donnell in our nation's capital.
We're here at the White House with the President of the United States.
Thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
You've never done an interview like this before.
That's correct.
Tonight, a congressional investigation sparked by reporting from CBS News.
What's your message to consumers?
They need help now.
Tell him I feel it.
The CBS Evening News with Nora